big presentation, but what I'd just like to do, just by way of context, is just to show a picture of the museum. I should have begun this by saying no mai harimai, which is Maori for welcome. This is the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa, and implicit in that title is the nature of the museum. It is, in fact, a bicultural museum. What's a bicultural museum? Well, it's a museum that recognises that back in the 19th century, two groups of people, the people of the land, that was the First Nation, the Maori, entered into a treaty with the people of the treaty, who were principally the British, to find a form of government and governance. And that treaty still is a living document that governs the way in which New Zealand runs and governs itself. The museum decided to take that a step further and to become a truly bicultural institution, a museum that is the Museum of Living Cultures. There are many museums that you can go to and you can look at the culture. Yes, you open the drawer, look at the culture, close the drawer, walk away again. And there is nothing sustainable around that. But when you come to this museum, the way in which you're greeted at the front door, and the museum is really well known internationally for this, the fact that we have a marae, a living marae, right at the very heart and centre of the museum, is fundamental to the way in which the museum operates. The fact that it is seeking to repatriate remains of forefathers, ancestors, and recently repatriated some from Montreal, is very much part of what the museum tries to do. And I think what this starts to indicate, and I'd just like to show one very last slide, which is what the museum takes its name from. It's a papaho, which is actually a treasure box. And I think when we're talking about cultural heritage and when we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about keeping our treasures. And this is the box that Maori would keep their treasures in, things like feathers and such like, things that were important to them. So the museum is a treasure house, Rarotonga, and this is fundamentally important. But in taking the decision to be bicultural and further iterations of that, the museum positioned itself almost as being morally and socially interventionist, as a catalyst for social change. And as a result of what the museum has done, the whole bicultural agenda in New Zealand has moved over 15 years while this museum has been open. And at a certain level, for example, the Maori New Year, known as Matariki, which occurs in June, that has become very much part of the calendar. So I'd actually suggest that I don't know a great deal about UNESCO, I don't know a great deal about big policy documents, but I do know about interacting with people. And I would like to suggest that the force that we're not really talking about is community, we're not talking about people. And my observation would be that certainly from the point of view of museums, they are becoming engaged directly with a whole range of issues that are relevant. They are becoming engaged with people, and government is playing a very different role in relation to that sort of sustainability. And what I've done is to identify different forms of capital, if you like. At the end of the day, we are about capital, and we are about investing effectively in a whole variety of areas. And the first capital, obviously, that a museum invests in, or tries to create, because we need to create this sort of capital, is cultural capital. I've identified three areas to that. Firstly, identity has been absolutely critical in the preservation of identity. I think it's one of the paradoxes of globalization that as the world becomes more like dentist fingers, you know how they all taste the same, the technology, the economics, the means of communication and transport are linking us more closely. Yet the paradox is that people everywhere are seeking a much firmer affirmation of their personal and individual and community identities. and there is clearly a trend in that. The second area that I would identify in museums as becoming very important is a move away from objectivity towards subjectivity. And that is built around museums being places of memory. It's obviously very closely linked to identity, but memory is fundamentally important. And a memory is what gives a community its identity. As someone has said, anybody who doesn't have a memory loses their identity. The same is true of communities. The third aspect of cultural capital, I would argue, is ownership of these treasures. They're not owned by the Board of Trustees, they're not actually owned by the government, and despite what they think, they're not actually owned by the curators either. They're actually owned by the people. And Te Papa, I think, is absolutely in the forefront of this particular area, in that the ownership of many of its collections do reside with the Maori people. And one of the big challenges for the museum is how to reconnect those people with their heritage physically. So that involves recognizing that those people are the authority, and that the authority of the institution resides in the extent to which its relationship works with that community. I'm just sort of highlighting some of these things, really. The second area that I identify that we need to build in is social capital. And fundamental to this, I think, is education from the cradle. It's a key driver in museums. It has been for 200 years. Sometimes we forget that in our discussion, because education is a long-term investment. And you can look at key performance indicators on that in terms of learning outcomes and so on. But what education gives you the opportunity to do is to drive a broader agenda, which is about changing hearts, changing minds, and changing lives. And that's really what we need to do. The third area of social capital is around government, and what is the role of government in all of this? My experience in the UK and in New Zealand is that government is more concerned about accountability than direction. You could argue that's quite a good thing. I'm happy to go along and explain the figures. I don't particularly want to go along and explain the intellectual direction of my institution and how we're actually engaging with issues of sustainability. Third area, economic capital. This is fundamentally important to museums. Museums have demonstrated that they have an economic output. In Wales, where I worked previously, we are able to work out the economic activity to the nation of Wales of the museums alone. We worked out the added value in terms of tourism, restaurants and bars benefiting from the museum, and numbers of people employed indirectly by the museum. And that had a factor of about 4 around it. So, very important area. We've equally seen, and you can see it here and elsewhere, that museums and cultural institutions sit at the heart of many of the largest urban economic regenerations that you see. So there is an interweave there. Museums are also about building environmental capital. Museums are one of the few places now where you can actually go and learn about taxonomy, about morphology, about systematics. They've been more or less kicked out of the university agenda. So museums are ideally placed to illustrate how the biodiversity of the world has been reduced. That links back to your education. It's equally a position where you can look at things such as ethnobotany, how First Nations use botany, how they use and understand science, because there are lessons in there to be learned. So there's a whole housing here of different treasures, different relationships. So, and I haven't even touched on a couple of other areas which would be interesting, maybe we can pick it up in discussion, of building international capital and building digital capital. So my argument is, let's have less government and more community. If we're looking at the really long term here, it's about communities being allowed to build their own nations. Nations aren't about borders. They are about identity, they're about memory. And museums, I think, are exemplars to some extent of ways in which that can occur, how that engagement takes place. It is complicated and it has to be related to education. And I would also argue that we have to be careful about maybe not being trying to be so objective. Some of the best things that I've seen in museums have been highly subjective. So those are the two sort of challenges I'm throwing down this afternoon.